Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 5.1b, and we are continuing our discussion of the impact of government policies on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. In this video, we are going to focus on monetary policy and how it affects the aggregate demand curve. We've already spoken a lot about monetary policy in Module 4, and today we're going to link what happens in the money demand and money supply model with what happens in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So if you recall, the goals of monetary policy, specifically changes in the money supply, are for the central bank to try to curb inflation or control inflation, or it can choose to try to promote growth and lower the unemployment rate. It's impossible for them to do both, so they have to choose. So let's see how changes in money supply affect the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Let's start off first with expansionary monetary policy. As you can imagine, this means that the Federal Reserve, or the central bank of an economy, is trying to increase the money supply. As you can see, an increase in the money supply is going to lead to a decrease in interest rates in the money demand and money supply model. Now remember, the money demand money supply model is going to be closely linked to the loanable funds market. So when we see an increase in the money supply, we have a temporary surplus of money at the original interest rate. People are going to take those extra money and take those extra funds and put them in interest-bearing assets, thereby increasing the supply of loanable funds. So what we see is that the interest rate starts to fall as we have the shift in the supply of loanable funds, or an increase in savings. We're going to see an increase in the quantity of loanable funds. This yields a movement along the demand curve, or the investment curve, in the loanable funds market. This is indicating that with the expansionary monetary policy, we see a drop in the interest rate and a subsequent increase in investment spending because there are more loanable funds available and those loans are now cheaper. So, what's going to happen in aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Well, remember, investment is one of the components of aggregate demand. So when we have a change in investment spending, we are also going to have a change in aggregate demand. An increase in investment spending tells us we're going to have an increase in aggregate demand. So expansionary monetary policy is going to indirectly affect the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model by increasing investment spending through its impact on interest rates, and thereby causing a shift out or to the right of the aggregate demand curve. Now notice what happens in the short run equilibrium. We experience an increase in prices, leading to an increase in inflation, but we also experience an increase in output. Higher output tells us that now we have lower unemployment. So expansionary monetary policy in the short run is going to lead to higher inflation, but also lower unemployment as it promotes growth. So now let's consider the opposite example. What happens if we have contractionary monetary policy? This is telling us that the money supply is decreasing. So the Federal Reserve, or the central bank of an economy, decides to decrease the money supply. When they do that, in the money demand and money supply market, we see a shift in or to the left of the money supply line. This yields an increase in the interest rate. How does this happen? Well, with the decrease in the money supply, temporarily we have a shortage of money at the original interest rate. We have upward pressure on the interest rate as people move some of their money out of interest-bearing assets and into liquid form to be able to exchange for the bonds that the Federal Reserve is offering them. By doing so, this causes a decrease in the supply of loanable funds, creating upward pressure on the interest rate. As this happens and we move to the new equilibrium in the loanable funds market, we have a movement along the investment curve, or along the demand curve in loanable funds. So we have upward pressure on the interest rate and lower quantity of loanable funds, meaning lower investment spending. The loans become more expensive and there are less loans available. Remember, investment, one of the components of aggregate demand. So if we see lower investment spending, we are also going to see a shift in or to the left of the aggregate demand curve. Once again, monetary policy is indirectly affecting the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model by its impact on interest rates and subsequently the impact on investment spending and loans that are available to businesses. And therefore, the shift in or to the left of the aggregate demand curve yields lower price level, but also lower output. So the result of this contractionary monetary policy is that the Federal Reserve, or the central bank of the economy, is able to curb inflation or lower inflation in some cases, but it's going to come at the cost of higher unemployment because we have lower output in this short-run fluctuation. So what have we learned in this segment? We've learned about what monetary policy is, and specifically its links to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. We can see that changes in the money supply, unlike changes in fiscal policy, are going to work indirectly in their impact on aggregate demand. So changes in money supply are going to affect interest rates, which in turn affect the quantity of loanable funds available and subsequently the investment spending in the economy, which in turn affects aggregate demand. Thank you so much for joining me for this segment 5.1b.